The war had dragged on for years, and every day brought new defeats for the coalition. Fleets that once stretched across the stars were now broken into fragments, hiding in deep space like hunted prey. Cities that once glowed with life were nothing but ashes, wiped out by the merciless Krell Dominion. In the Grand War Council chamber aboard the alien flagship Aurealis, the mood was heavy and dark. Generals of different species argued loudly, each blaming the other for failure. Some shouted about the lack of fuel and food, others cursed the broken fleets that could no longer fight. Their voices rose higher, but behind their anger was fear. Many whispered that surrender was the only path left. No one wanted to say it openly, but they all felt the weight of defeat pressing on them. The chamber itself seemed to reflect their despair. The high ceilings, once decorated with shining banners, now looked dull. The great holo table in the center showed red marks spreading across the galaxy, each mark a lost world, each glowing scar a burned system. They had tried everything: massive fleet engagements, defensive lines, desperate alliances, but the Krell crushed them all. The Krell were too many, too ruthless, too strong. The Council was breaking apart, just like the fleets. It was then that the doors of the chamber opened and the sound of firm footsteps echoed through the hall. Heads turned toward the newcomers. 2 humans walked inside. They looked small compared to the towering alien generals, yet they carried themselves with a strange calmness. Captain Daniel Carter, broad-shouldered but not imposing, and Commander Laura Mitchell, sharp-eyed and confident, stood before the council. They had been invited as a last gamble, though many alien leaders doubted them. Humanity was new to the galactic stage, seen as fragile and inexperienced. What could they offer against an enemy that had broken empires centuries old? The murmurs began immediately. Some alien generals hissed in disgust, others laughed bitterly. A tall reptilian warlord leaned forward and sneered that humans were latecomers who had never truly fought a galactic war. A feathered alien admiral whispered to another that the humans would be crushed before they could even learn the first lesson of battle. Yet, Daniel and Laura did not flinch. They stood silently until the room grew quiet again. Daniel then stepped forward, his voice steady. He did not speak of human technology, for everyone knew Earth's fleets were small. He did not promise overwhelming firepower, because they did not have it. Instead, he spoke of history. Earth's endless wars, its centuries of battles where weaker nations had stood against stronger ones and survived through will and cunning. He reminded them that humanity had faced hopeless odds many times on their own world and had found ways to endure. He told them that the Krell were not gods, only enemies, and enemies could be broken if one dared to think differently. Some scoffed at this. One alien general slammed his fist on the table, demanding proof, demanding numbers and guarantees. Laura Mitchell answered instead. Her voice was sharp, her tone like steel. She spoke not of numbers, but of tactics. She described ambushes, deception, the art of misdirection. She spoke of fighting smart instead of fighting big. The aliens were used to honor duels, to grand fleets meeting head-on in predictable patterns. Laura explained how humans had often used smaller forces to outthink larger ones. The Krell expect you to fight their way, she said, her eyes scanning the room, so stop fighting their way. Her words stirred something in the chamber. For a moment, the council members grew silent, unsettled. They did not want to admit it, but their old strategies had failed again and again. Perhaps these strange humans had seen something they had missed. Yet doubt remained. What could 2 humans possibly achieve where entire empires had failed? The council debated, their voices rising once more, until finally the decision was made. They would give the humans command of a single sector. It was already considered lost, a region overrun by the Krell, barely defended. If the humans failed, nothing would change. If by some miracle they succeeded, perhaps it would buy the coalition time. The aliens thought they were handing the humans a hopeless task, but Daniel Carter and Laura Mitchell accepted without hesitation. As they left the chamber, the alien generals muttered among themselves. Many believed the humans would die quickly, that their bold words would fade in the fire of the Krell. But some noticed the way Daniel's jaw was set, the way Laura's eyes burned with determination. These were not people who came to beg or to surrender. They came to fight. And for the first time in many months, A spark of something unfamiliar began to rise in the council chamber. It was not quite hope, not yet, but it was close. Outside, as they returned to their small group of volunteers, Daniel and Laura exchanged a brief look. They both knew the truth. The coalition was finished if nothing changed. Entire civilizations were already falling apart. But humanity had nothing to lose and everything to prove. Daniel thought of Earth, of all the wars and struggles that had shaped his people. Laura thought of the soldiers waiting for leadership, soldiers who had lost everything but still wanted to fight. They both understood that the burden was heavy, but it was also an opportunity. In the distance, stars burned cold and silent, indifferent to the struggles of life. Yet, Daniel Carter and Laura Mitchell believed those stars could still witness something new. The Krell thought the war was nearly won. The Coalition thought the war was nearly lost. But humanity had just entered the field, and humanity had a history of changing impossible battles into victories. The War Council had dismissed them as desperate newcomers. But soon the galaxy would see what desperate newcomers could do. For in that moment, standing in the shadow of despair, Daniel and Laura made an unspoken promise to each other and to every species in the Coalition. They would not give up, and they would not bow to the Krell. If the galaxy thought humans were fragile, they would show them just how dangerous fragility could be when it refused to break. Daniel studied the map of the sector they had been given, a broken stretch of space already marked red with Krell occupation. The Alien Council had chosen it because they believed it was worthless, a place where the humans could fail quietly and no one would notice. Yet, to Daniel and Laura, it was the perfect place to begin. They didn't need glory or recognition. They needed a battlefield where they could prove humanity's way of war worked. The fleet assigned to them was pitiful, a collection of battered cruisers, half-functioning frigates, and a handful of civilian freighters converted into warships. Many of the crew members were volunteers who had lost their families, their homes, or their entire worlds. Their eyes were hollow with grief, but when Laura spoke to them, she gave them something else to hold on to: purpose. She told them they would not fight for medals or for the Council's approval. They would fight to strike back, to show the Krell that even those considered broken could still bleed them. The first change Daniel made was to stop thinking like the Coalition. Instead of ordering fleets into rigid formations, he spread them out, hiding them in asteroid fields, moons, and nebula clouds. Supply depots were no longer static targets. They became traps rigged with explosives. Civilian freighters were outfitted with false signals, pretending to be retreating ships, luring Krell patrols into ambushes. Laura took a squadron of smaller strike craft and drilled them relentlessly, teaching them to board Krell transports, sabotage engines, and vanish before reinforcements arrived. The aliens serving under them struggled at first. They were used to clear orders, strict formations, and battles fought in straight lines. The human way felt chaotic, reckless even. But when the first raid succeeded, when a Krell fuel convoy was destroyed without the loss of a single ship, those doubts began to fade. The Coalition officers who had laughed at the humans started taking notes. The soldiers who had once doubted their new commanders began following them with fierce loyalty. The Krell were unprepared for this kind of warfare. They expected the Coalition to gather for grand fleet battles, not to strike from shadows. Their patrol routes became dangerous, their supply lines fragile. Reports began piling up of missing convoys, destroyed outposts, and ambushed reinforcements. The Krell commanders responded with heavier escorts, but that only made them slower, easier to predict. Each adjustment they made, the humans twisted against them, turning their strength into weakness. Laura became infamous among the Krell when she personally led a raid on a command station near the edge of the sector. Disguised as a crippled civilian vessel, her strike team boarded the station under the cover of distress. By the time the Krell realized the trap, the humans had already planted explosives and escaped. The station was destroyed in a fireball so bright it could be seen from 3 systems away. Survivors spoke in fear of the humans who fought with madness in their eyes, and Krell soldiers gave her a name whispered with dread: the Phantom Commander. Daniel, meanwhile, studied the Krell with the obsession of a man who refused to lose. He pored over intercepted transmissions, enemy fleet movements, and battle records. He discovered patterns in the Krell command structure, weaknesses in their discipline, flaws in their reliance on fear to keep their troops in line. He began crafting strategies to break their will, not just their fleets. For Daniel, every skirmish was more than survival. It was a lesson, a test, a way to sharpen humanity's edge. The Coalition Council took notice when reports arrived of Krell retreats in sectors once thought lost. Some dismissed them as luck, others as exaggerations. But when footage spread of the humans leading ragged alien fleets to victory, the whispers began again. Could it be that the humans had found a way to fight the Krell where no one else had succeeded? For the first time in years, morale shifted. Alien soldiers began to believe the war could be fought differently, that they were not doomed to defeat. Daniel and Laura never promised them easy victories. They only promised them a chance to fight back, to make the Krell bleed for every step forward. That promise was enough to light fires in hearts that had grown cold with despair. In the cold silence of space, Krell commanders who once advanced without fear now hesitated. They no longer trusted their maps, their supply chains, or their own superiority. Something new was hunting them in the shadows, something small, fragile, but terrifyingly clever. For the first time, the Krell began to feel the taste of uncertainty, and it came from humans. The Krell warlord sent his fleet into Vera 9 with brutal confidence, certain that the humans' string of small victories would end there. Dozens of heavy cruisers and carriers cut through the darkness, their weapons primed to burn everything in their path. The asteroid belt shimmered with metal-rich rocks, scattered debris from ancient collisions, and hidden within it waited Daniel's plan. He had turned the mining fields into weapons. Old drills and excavation charges were repurposed as mines, their signals masked by the natural radiation of the belt. Freighters drifted like derelicts, hollowed out and packed with explosives. The Krell entered, believing they were facing nothing but scattered resistance, but every step forward tightened the noose. Laura commanded the hidden strike teams, her voice sharp and steady through the comms. Dozens of frigates lay inside hollowed-out asteroids, their hulls disguised with rock plating. The crews waited in silence as the Krell ships advanced deeper, confident of an easy kill. The moment the enemy reached the center of the belt, Laura gave the order. From the shadows, the asteroids came alive with fire. Beams cut across the darkness, torpedoes erupted from unexpected angles, and the Krell fleet was suddenly caught in a crossfire from every direction. Chaos erupted. Krell cruisers turned to fire at phantom targets, smashing asteroids into fragments, only to reveal more hidden guns behind them. The belt itself became a storm of death as shattered rocks turned into deadly shrapnel, tearing through shields and hulls alike. Daniel kept calm, directing the battle like a conductor guiding an orchestra. Every Krell maneuver had been anticipated, every retreat cut off. They were caught in a trap so carefully built they didn't even realize it until it was too late. For 3 days, the battle raged. The humans and their allies struck fast, then vanished into the belt, forcing the Krell into exhausting chases that ended in fresh ambushes. Laura personally led a squadron into the heart of the Krell formation, boarding their supply ships and detonating them from within. Her strike teams moved like shadows, leaving behind only wreckage and confusion. Krell soldiers swore they had seen her eyes glowing in the dark corridors, whispering that she was not a woman, but a ghost made of war. On the final day, when the Krell gathered what was left of their strength to break out, Daniel revealed his last card. Buried deep in the largest asteroids were chain charges, massive mining explosives that had been carefully positioned during weeks of preparation. As the Krell ships clustered in desperation, Daniel triggered the sequence. One by one, the asteroids detonated in a chain reaction, sending shockwaves that ripped through the belt. Fire and stone tore into the Krell fleet, crushing ships between colliding rocks, ripping apart entire carriers in blinding flashes of light. When the dust settled, the once proud Krell warlords' fleet was gone. Only wreckage drifted among the shattered belt, glowing red from the fires of destroyed reactors. The Coalition had watched the battle unfold in stunned silence, their own fleets unable to believe what they had witnessed. The Krell, who had once seemed unstoppable, had been shattered not by overwhelming force, but by cunning, patience, and human unpredictability. Whispers spread across the galaxy. The Krell had been defeated in open combat, their ships torn apart by a people they once mocked as weak. The Alien Council, still wary, demanded reports, proof, explanations. But for the soldiers who had fought in the Belt, there was no doubt. They had seen humans turn an impossible battle into victory, and they knew something had changed forever. Daniel Carter stood on the bridge of his battered flagship, watching the remains of the Krell fleet drift into silence. His crew cheered around him, voices filled with hope for the first time in years. Laura returned from her raid, her armor scorched and dented, her eyes alight with the fire of survival. The two exchanged a look that said, "Everything, this was only the beginning." The galaxy had just learned that humans were not prey. They were predators with a talent for the impossible, and now the Krell knew it too. Daniel walked through the shipyards with a critical eye, studying rows of crippled cruisers and rusted freighters. To most, they looked like junk, ships too damaged or outdated to ever fly in battle again. But to him, they were tools waiting to be reshaped. He saw possibilities where others saw wreckage. Laura stood beside him, her arms folded, her voice sharp as she told the engineers, "We don't need perfect ships. We need dangerous ones." The transformation began in secret corners of space. Old freighters were stripped and packed with hidden reactors, turned into giant bombs disguised as helpless transports. Small drones were rigged to carry false engine signatures, tricking Krell patrols into chasing shadows. Daniel designed maneuvers that looked chaotic to alien eyes but flowed with precision, circling attacks, feints that baited enemy commanders into overextending, retreats that were never retreats at all. Many alien admirals resisted. They argued that honor was in facing the enemy openly, that such tricks were cowardly. Daniel didn't argue. Instead, he let his plans speak for him. On the defense of Marvis Prime, when a Krell fleet bore down on a colony world, Daniel lured them with a decoy of freighters transmitting distress calls. The Krell attacked eagerly, only to be caught when the helpless wrecked ships detonated and crippled their vanguard. Coalition forces, waiting in the shadows, surged forward and annihilated the rest. The colony was saved and the doubters had no words. Laura worked with the crews themselves, training them not to wait for orders but to act on instinct. She gathered humans and aliens together, drilling them with scenarios so unpredictable that hesitation meant failure. "War isn't neat," she told them, pacing the training hall. "It's dirty, fast, and it never goes to plan. If you wait, you die. If you adapt, you live." At first, the aliens struggled, too bound by tradition, but slowly they began to change. They started making decisions on their own, turning mistakes into opportunities. For the first time, they were fighting like humans. Victories began piling up. Krell patrols that once hunted with ease now fell into traps. Supply convoys vanished into ambushes. Entire fleets found themselves striking at ghosts, unable to pin down their elusive enemy. The coalition ships, once predictable, now moved with a rhythm that baffled even their own commanders. They were no longer fighting as a collection of broken species. They were fighting like a pack, swift and coordinated with humans at their heart. Word spread quickly. Soldiers whispered about Daniel's calm command, about how he could predict the Krell's every move before they made it. They told stories of Laura leading raids so sudden and sharp that entire stations were silenced before alarms could sound. The names of the two humans carried through the ranks, sparking loyalty not through orders, but through belief. The Krell noticed too. Where once they had advanced without hesitation, now they slowed. Reports came of their admirals second-guessing maneuvers, of soldiers glancing nervously into shadows, of commanders demanding more scouts to protect their flanks. Fear was creeping into the Dominion, and it was born from the humans' way of war. One night, standing alone on the observation deck, Daniel looked out at the stars. The coalition had begun to trust them, but he knew trust was fragile. They had won battles, not the war. Yet deep inside, he felt the shift. The Krell were no longer invincible. Humanity had taught the galaxy something new, that the fight was not about numbers or size or brute strength. It was about adaptability, deception, and the will to never bow. And as Laura joined him on the deck, a faint smile tugged at her lips. "They're starting to move like us," she said quietly. Daniel nodded, his eyes on the endless dark. "Good," he replied, "because the Krell won't know how to stop it." Krell commanders sat in their war councils, their claws tapping in frustration as reports arrived one after another. Patrols missing, convoys destroyed, soldiers refusing to advance where human-led fleets were rumored to lurk. For centuries, the Dominion had been the predator, feared across the galaxy, but now whispers of doubt slithered through their ranks. The humans had given the Coalition something the Krell had never faced before: unpredictability. Daniel made sure every victory echoed louder than it should. After each battle, fragments of Krell wreckage were brought across enemy channels, taunting them with proof of failure. Hollow messages spread lies and truths alike, mixing fact with illusion until even the Krell could not tell where the humans truly were. "They think fear is their weapon," Daniel said to his officers, his voice steady, but fear cuts both ways. Laura turned fear into legend. Her boarding teams struck without warning, vanishing before reinforcements arrived. Krell soldiers began calling her the Ghost Captain, a name carried through their camps with unease. Survivors swore they saw her in places she couldn't possibly be, whispering commands in burning corridors or watching silently as engines failed. The myth of her presence grew larger than reality, and the Krell started hesitating at the thought of facing her again. Coalition soldiers who once mocked the humans now copied them, mimicking their raids and tricks. Squadrons of alien fighters flew like Laura's teams, unpredictable and swift. Fleet captains tested Daniel's strategies and found them effective, realizing the old rules of honor and tradition had only chained them to defeat. The change spread like fire, one success feeding another, courage rising from despair. The shift was clear in the enemy. Krell forces, once relentless, began to pause before advancing. Some even retreated at the sight of human-marked vessels, convinced they were stepping into a trap. Warlords argued bitterly among themselves, their unity cracking as commanders blamed each other for losses that should have been impossible. Daniel had studied their hierarchy well. He knew their leaders ruled through fear, and when fear faltered, discipline broke with it. In the quiet after battle, Laura sat with her crew, listening to their laughter for the first time since the war began. They were no longer waiting to die. They believed they could win. She leaned back, closing her eyes for a moment, and whispered, "They're the ones afraid now." Daniel stood at the edge of a star map, watching the shifting lines. Every small victory had been part of a larger design, not just to bleed the Krell, but to make them doubt themselves. The Coalition had thought humans weak, but now even the strongest alien warriors admitted the truth. Humanity had changed the war. And the Krell, once feared across the stars, were learning a feeling they had never expected: fear of the humans. The order arrived in silence, hidden behind layers of coded transmissions. Certain council leaders, jealous of the humans' rising influence, had decided the risk was too great. Daniel and Laura were to be recalled, replaced by commanders who would restore proper tradition to the Coalition war effort. On paper, it was politics. In truth, it was betrayal. Daniel learned of it not from the council, but from the battlefield itself. Reinforcements promised for a critical engagement never arrived. Messages to allied fleets went unanswered. When the Krell launched a massive offensive into their sector, Daniel and Laura were left alone to face it. Dozens of enemy warships descended, their black hulls blotting out the stars. The Coalition had abandoned them to die. Laura's ship, the Horizon Star, led the vanguard. She fought like a storm, weaving her damaged craft through volleys of plasma fire, striking back with precision. Her crew followed her without hesitation, knowing the odds, knowing this might be their last stand. Daniel's flagship, battered but unyielding, coordinated the chaos, turning desperation into strategy. Together, they fought with everything they had. But the Krell came in endless waves. The Horizon Star took hit after hit, its shields buckling, decks torn apart by fire. Laura refused to retreat, her voice steady over the comms as she ordered her strike teams into one last boarding raid, buying time for Daniel to regroup. When her ship finally broke apart under the enemy's guns, Daniel's chest tightened with rage, but her final transmission carried no fear, only defiance. His fleet staggered under the assault, half destroyed, but Daniel forced a breakout, dragging what remained through the edge of the system. Bloodied, furious, and betrayed, he brought his crippled flagship back to Aurealis. The council chamber erupted with excuses when he demanded answers, but Daniel silenced them with a single roar that carried through the hall. He laid their cowardice bare before every officer present, accusing them not only of treachery, but of dooming the war itself. The politicians shifted, muttering about order and balance, but the soldiers who had fought under human command rose in outrage. Veterans of every species stood shoulder to shoulder, their voices uniting in defiance. They shouted that they would follow Daniel and Laura, not the council. They declared they would not fight under leaders who abandoned their own. The chamber trembled with the sound of rebellion. The politicians had tried to cut humanity out, but instead they had ignited a fire. The coalition's armies, weary and battered, had found something worth believing in. Not words, not tradition, but leaders who bled beside them. And in that moment, the soldiers made their choice. The humans would not be recalled. They would be followed. Borealis burned with the light of war. The Krell had come with everything they had, their largest armada stretching across the system like a black tide. Their ships darkened the stars, thousands of them surging toward the coalition capital. The defense lines collapsed one after another, and the sky above the jewel of the coalition world turned into a storm of fire. This was the end game. The Krell meant to finish the war in one crushing blow. Daniel stood at the command deck, eyes locked on the swarm of red markers flooding the holomap. His voice, calm but iron, cut through the fear hanging in the room. We let them think they've won. Then we take everything from them. It was a plan that sounded like madness, but madness was all they had left. He ordered the defenses to fall back in a controlled retreat, pulling the Krell deeper and deeper toward Borealis. To the enemy, it looked like victory. To Daniel, it was the bait of the trap. Laura led the sharpest edge of that trap. Her strike teams, battered survivors from 100 raids, boarded Krell ships in suicidal runs, disabling engines, sowing chaos, then vanishing into escape pods or stolen craft. She was everywhere at once, her voice steady over the comms. Keep them chasing shadows. Don't let them see the teeth until it's too late. The Krell pressed forward, blinded by their hunger for destruction, never realizing the net was closing around them. Hours turned into days. Borealis' surface shook from orbital bombardments, its skies a burning storm. Coalition fleets fought like cornered wolves, losing ships by the dozen, but holding just long enough. At the center of it all, Daniel gave the final signal. From hidden positions behind moons, nebula clouds, and hollowed asteroids, the Coalition's reserves surged out. The trap snapped shut with brutal precision. The Krell fleet, once unstoppable, suddenly found themselves surrounded. Their formations broke apart under crossfire, their supply ships already gutted, their command relays shattered. In the heart of the chaos, Laura led her most dangerous mission yet, a direct assault on the Krell command ship. Her boarding team tore through corridors dripping with smoke and blood, fighting room by room until they reached the central chamber. The battle inside was savage. The Krell warlord towered over them, armored and furious, his blade cutting through steel and bone. Laura faced him head-on, her body screaming with exhaustion, her mind sharpened by rage. The fight was brutal, close, desperate, until she found the opening and drove her weapon through the warlord's chest. His death cry echoed across the ship, transmitted unknowingly to every Krell channel. Their commander was gone, their fleet leaderless. Daniel seized the moment. Now, he commanded, his fleet hammering the Krell with every weapon they had left. With their warlords slain and their trap closing in, the Krell lines collapsed. Ships scattered, retreating in disarray, their mighty armada torn apart not by strength but by cunning, sacrifice, and human defiance. When the fires dimmed, Borealis still stood, burned, scarred, but alive. Coalition soldiers stared at the wreckage of the Krell fleet and realized what had happened. They had survived the impossible. And at the center of it all, standing bloodied but unbroken, were the humans who had led them there. For the first time, the galaxy saw the Krell not as monsters beyond defeat, but as prey who could be hunted. The last stand of Borealis had become the first true victory of the war. The wreckage of the Krell armada drifted across the void like a graveyard, their shattered hulls glowing faintly as fires burned themselves out. Coalition ships, though scarred and broken, still held formation around Borealis. The battle was over, but the silence that followed carried more weight than the thunder of guns. For the first time in living memory, the Krell had not advanced. They had fled. Daniel stood before the War Council once more, but the chamber no longer felt the same. Where once suspicion and disdain had filled the air, now there was respect, heavy and reluctant, but undeniable. Council leaders who had dismissed humanity now leaned forward, their eyes following his every word. Soldiers crowded the galleries above, their cheers echoing faintly whenever his name was spoken. Humanity was no longer an afterthought. They were the turning point. Laura entered the chamber limping, her armor scorched, her body marked with wounds earned aboard the Krell command ship. Yet her presence drew silence. Stories of her duel with the warlord had already spread across the fleets. To the soldiers, she was no longer just a commander. She was living proof that the Krell could be killed. Whispers followed her wherever she walked, not of weakness, but of legend. The council tried to shape the narrative, to frame the victory as a coalition effort, but the truth was too bright to hide. Everyone knew who had changed the course of the war. It was the humans, the fragile newcomers, who had turned despair into defiance and chaos into triumph. The counselors bowed their heads, not in submission, but in acknowledgement. Across the galaxy, messages rippled outward. Worlds that had considered surrender now armed themselves again. Soldiers who had been broken by defeat stood taller. The phrase spread like wildfire in dozens of languages. The humans changed the game. It became a rallying cry, painted on the hulls of ships, whispered in the trenches, shouted in victory after every raid. The Krell themselves felt the shift. Their fleets, once driven by unshakable confidence, moved cautiously now, their commanders watching the shadows with suspicion. They no longer believed in their own invincibility. Fear had crept into the heart of the Dominion, and it carried the shape of human defiance. On the bridge of his flagship, Daniel watched the stars beyond Aurealis, his expression calm but resolute. "This isn't the end," he told Laura quietly. She stood beside him, her gaze fierce despite the exhaustion in her body. "No," she answered, "it's the beginning." The war would continue, battles still to be fought, lives still to be lost. But the balance had shifted forever. Humanity, once dismissed as weak and fragile, had proven they were something else entirely. They were dangerous, relentless, and impossible to predict. The galaxy had underestimated them, and now it would never forget. The Krell had tried to end the war with fire. Instead, they had lit the dawn of something far more enduring, the rise of humanity among the stars.